Thank you so much, Kim. And once again, I would like to, so we have Rachel, the director for this amazing film that we all just watched. We have Barry Goldstein. We have Jacqueline Franchetti. We have uh, we have Kathleen Russell, and so let's. The first question I want to just open this up with, and this is for all of you folks. All of you are going to have something to contribute to this. How did we get here? No one set up to make a system that ruins children's lives, that ruins women's lives. No one intended for something this bad to happen, but here we are. And when we understand the origins of a problem, we're better equipped to fix it. So, my question to all of you, how did we get here?
And the panelists may be muted.
Yeah.
Okay.
There we go.
Yeah, there's a history here. In the 1970s, when domestic violence first became a public issue, there was no research. And the assumption was that domestic violence was caused by mental illness or substance abuse. And so the courts turned to mental health professionals who are experts in psychology and mental illness, but not domestic violence or child abuse. And we now know, and we've known for a long time, that the original assumptions were wrong. And yet, the court to do the mistaken approaches. On top of that, you had a cottage industry led by Richard Gardner that realized they could make a lot of money by promoting approaches that favor abusive fathers, and that's what they've done. And the misinformation that the cottage industry has spread has poisoned the system. And the courts, we've now had a generation of court officials who have heard misinformation their entire careers and are very defensive about the enormous harm that they've caused, and its children and its protective mothers who are suffering.
Melanie, I'll go ahead and jump in if that's okay.
Please, yeah, everyone, I want to contribute to this one because everyone's got their own perspective on it.
For those of you who are out there, I am Jacqueline Franchetti. I am Kira's mom. And I remember almost 7 years ago when I first walked into Nassau County Family Court. And I thought, like many of you who are out there, first time or people who may be talking about this topic for the first time, I thought our courts would protect Kira and would protect me as a victim of domestic violence. And I could not believe how far that is from the truth. I mean, how could that be? Our court system, I'm from New York, but it's not just in New York State, it's all around the country. It's happening in every courthouse, in every county, in every state. How could it be that this is what's going on, what Barry just described? I mean, I felt like I was walking into the twilight zone. I could not believe that our court system does not protect our child, but instead protects the abuser. It's absolutely upside down and backwards. And for those of you who are out there right now listening, I've experienced what is probably your worst nightmare. My 28-month-old daughter, her name is Kira. She was on a court-approved visit with her abusive father, who shot her twice in the back while she slept. He then proceeded to pour gasoline all over his home, set it on fire, and he killed himself in a murder-suicide. And Kira's murder was 100% preventable. She should never have been there that day. And I'm sure as we progress through the panel, I'll share more of you what happened in our family court nightmare and our experiences there. But everyone in her custody case knew that her father was suicidal, knew that he was dangerous, that he was an abuser. There were red flags. There were eyewitness accounts that were brought forward to the judge, the forensic evaluator, to the attorney for the child, and no one stepped in to help her. And where we are today, Melanie, as you asked, is we're in a space that is in desperate, dire need for change. And that change is not going to come from inside our family court system. That change has to come from legislative measures, from executive measures, from policy and advocacy changes to bring about a new tomorrow. The day is here. Hope is here. But it's not just up to me or us. It's up to all of us to make that change.
Thank you so much, Jacqueline. Oh, Rachel, I see you.
Yeah, I'd like to tell you about how I got here after making this film, or beginning to make this film. 8 years ago, I think I started this film. I went to make a film about Charlotta. It was a short film, and she introduced me to the shelter, and that's where I met the young lady Misty, who gives birth in the film. And she was being advised in her court appearance that I was around for, but I didn't go to. She was being advised to not mention her abuse in court about the custody of her children. And I sort of took the woman at the shelter to the side and I said, I think you've got this incredibly wrong. You know, this is not right. She needs to say everything about it, because that's what's going to, you know, do her a favor. And anyway, that sort of led on to Misty eventually losing her baby. And I got on the aeroplane after filming that, not expecting to film that. And I was absolutely enraged and I didn't know what to do with myself. And I was just so angry and upset and confused, because it just didn't make any sense to me. And so I thought, right, initially I thought, right, I'll make a film so that we can get Misty a lawyer, because then it'll fix that. And then I started talking to people and realizing it wasn't just that, it was everywhere. It was an endemic problem. And so that began the journey of making this film, which took me 6 years, trying to answer to my own satisfaction, was this really happening? Is this really real? And yes, sadly it is. I went to visit with Kathleen and Barry, and I've met so many people on this film to help me figure out what is real. And all I wanted to do with film was just show what I was seeing. I didn't want to say, you've got to do this, you've got to do that. It was just like, let's open the door, let's open the windows and show what is happening in this situation to people who don't get seen. Because in this situation, most of the time, a mother will go through this and it seems like the most insane, ridiculous thing that's ever happened. And then when it's all past and everything's done, you'll stick your head above the parapet and you can see other women, you know, that have been through this, but by which time it's too late. And I'm really excited that you guys are putting this film on tonight so that other people can see it and benefit from the information. And just if there's a light shone it can't hide, and we can do something about it, and leads to discussion like this. I think that's incredibly important.
Thank you, Rachel. Kathleen, do you have any perspective on this, on how we got
Sure, definitely. And this is this month is the 15-year anniversary of our having a couple of neighbors sitting in a living room in San Rafael saying, you know, we've got to stop picketing the courthouse here and figure out what we can do to deal with this, thinking it was just a local problem. So we started the Center for Judicial Excellence and brought our little film that we made back in 2007 and 8 to the Battered Mothers Custody Conference, and learned that this was endemic and an epidemic around the world. So hello to all the people who might be tuning in from outside the US. This is sadly really taken off like a cancer in courtrooms across the world. So my belief and the founding belief of the Center for Judicial Excellence is that it's a lack of accountability in the court system, which has led us to what we have right now. Similar to the Catholic Church pedophile scandal, if you have an insular institution, and in that case it was the Catholic Church, and in our case it's the court system, where there really are no checks or balances, where judges can routinely, flagrantly violate the law and not be held accountable for that, where psychologists and custody evaluators can write bogus reports, charge whatever the market will bear, and essentially the oversight agencies at various state levels are not disciplining these unethical evaluators, we're just going to continue to see what we've been seeing. It's like a good old boy, good old girl network where it's, you know, I'll pat you on the back, I'll give you this contract, I'll assign you to this case if you just, you know, keep the money flowing. And so I do believe it's an unregulated cottage industry that is not about protecting the best interests of children, but there's nobody holding the system accountable. So I believe that the root of fixing the system is through public education and mobilization, as Jacqueline referred to. And we just need to continue to work the media and work with legislators to hold the system accountable, because until there's a culture shift, right, where it does matter if people are committing perjury, and it does matter if judges are flagrantly violating the law or harming children with their decisions, you know, we've got to focus on that, in my view. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And you touched on something both in the film and just now that I want to ask about again. Why is this something that most people on the street, most experts, most legislators, most people in general have never heard of? Why do you think this is so? I mean, every protective mother I've ever known who, when they first find themselves in this kind of situation, like what Jacqueline described, every single one says, I thought I was the only person who this ever happened to. Because they've never heard of this. And granted, it does push the bounds of the human imagination. But why do you think there's so little discussion about this, so little information about this? And that's open to everyone. Jacqueline, you're on mute.
There you go, sorry. So as you look at domestic violence and child abuse, these are things that exist and stay in a vacuum, and people want to keep these behind closed doors. We all know that abusers wear masks. They are one person in public and another person as soon as the door closes. And abuse thrives in silence. So, you know, we've now, I think, come to an incredible tipping point where people are starting to really recognize that there's a problem. For those of you out there, I focus a tremendous amount of my work in New York State. And in fact, we have 3 bills that are inspired by Kira's custody case that we're advancing in the New York State legislature right now. And as I have conversations with people in government, in different advocacy groups, in different arenas around this, I'm seeing the number of people who now recognize that this is a significant problem. And not only that there's a problem, but there are solutions attached to this. And yes, many of these are legislative, by the way, including something called Kira's Law, which is named after my daughter, Kira, which is to make the health and safety of the child the top priority. It still exists in this vacuum, though, going back to your question, Melanie. And we're seeing protective moms who are punished for protecting. I'm able to speak because my daughter, Kira, was murdered. And that should never have happened. But there are moms and dads, protective parents who are out there right now who, when they speak up, are actually held accountable by the judge and punished for doing so. So the vacuum exists, and we have the problem that exists and continues to exist. Like I said, though, I'm thankful that people are beginning to recognize this problem and starting to see that there are ways that we can help people going forward.
I'd kind of like to say that actually when I started making this film, finding any information out about this subject was really, really tough. It was not easy to do. So this is like 2012, 13. But I'm really happy to say that you can search this issue and find information pretty quickly now. And I feel like that is a positive thing, you know, that if people are talking about it, we're going to move on. So that's within the last sort of 6-7 years. So that's just my experience.
Thank you for that, and thank you for being part of that change. Anyone else?
Well, one thing I would say, I appreciate the work that Rachel did. She told a really compelling story. And towards the end, she offered some solutions. And it was the Quincy solution, is the solution to end domestic violence crime. And it's the Safe Child Act that is needed to make custody courts safe for women and children. And that I found that really hopeful. And of course, Kira's Law and Caden's Law are part of the Safe Child Act, because the Safe Child Act is a comprehensive proposal. I noticed recently that in California, they have some language to make health and safety the priority. But unfortunately, they didn't do the rest of it. They didn't require that the scientific research be included. They didn't have an early hearing limited to supervised to abuse issues. I think they have made strides to try to train the judges, but there's still a long way to go. And I think with the training of judges, not only do we need to train them in the research and new information that they desperately need and don't have, but we also have to retrain them, because they, over the years, have absorbed so much misinformation that they just assume is true. And, you know, they don't even think about it when we present the research that says that a lot of the standard practices courts have been using all this time are really harmful for children.
Thank you for that. And that actually segues into a question I'm seeing from a guest. I'm going to ask this, I'm going to post this one, but then before even we go there, I do want to reiterate. Nothing we say today should be construed as legal advice. None of us here are practicing lawyers. We can talk about generalities in family court. We can talk about concepts. We can talk about legal principles. We are not giving legal advice, and nothing we say here should be construed as that. A more general question that could not possibly be construed at it, but Barry just touched on. What's being done reactively and proactively to educate lawyers and judges on this topic? What about GALs and others who are major decision makers on our custody cases?
Well, you know, what we've been talking about is particularly the ACE study and the Saunders study. And we should mention that the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges seeks to train judges about this research. And you would think and you would hope that that would mean that more and more judges would learn about this, which would certainly change the outcome of a lot of cases. The problem is that very few judges are getting this training, and in some cases, they think they know everything, so they're not listening. And, many of our viewers don't know that the Stop Abuse campaign held a series of phone calls with a group of experts that the National Council put together. And we were really in agreement on almost everything that we talked about in terms of the changes that are needed. And I think what's really frustrating is it's not getting further, that in many ways, the court system has this insular atmosphere. So a number of years ago, I did a training on ACE and Saunders at the National Convention of the American Psychological Association. The APA believed that their psychologists needed training on ACE and Saunders, and yet almost none of the evaluators, who are mostly psychologists, are using that research. And that's a big part of why they're getting it wrong. And of course, some of them are part of the cottage industry, would not use ACE and Saunders because it would help protective mothers and their children, not the abusers that the cottage industry serves. But even for professionals who aren't part of the cottage industry, it's a lot easier to give a subject. They can say whatever they believe, whatever helps their client, and that's a lot easier than having to do the work to learn the research and to give an objective opinion.
Melanie, when I was first going through learning about family court practices and learning everything that went wrong, I attended a ton of different training programs. And in fact, that's where I first met Barry at one of his training programs up in New York State. And I can tell you firsthand, I was appalled at many of the training programs that I attended about what horrible information they were putting out there, how this was not advancing things, and I was honestly shocked by it. And as I started to work on legislation, 2 laws right now that we have in New York State deal with training. Kira's law deals with training for judges, and we have a forensic evaluator training bill. And in both bills, we were very specific not only about the type of curriculum that needs to go in here, but also who conducts these training programs. And that's very key, because there are a number of training programs that are out there, but it needs to be the right kind of training done by the right types of organizations, one that truly understands domestic violence, child abuse, and trauma. And we need to make sure these are designated as such, so that those who do go through these training programs are hearing things about Saunders, about ACE, about Joan Meyer's work, about others that are out there, to make sure they're getting the right information. And that's really key.
Yeah, thank you. And I agree with that. In this context and a lot of other contexts, I find myself saying education only fixes things caused by ignorance, and that's part of the problem. That's not all of it, but yeah, that is certainly part of it. And judges don't usually take well to people on the street telling them what to do. That's kind of, they got the job they got, so they can be above that in large part. Does anyone else want to jump in on that?
Can you restate the question? I've been busy responding to chats.
Oh, it's fine.
Yeah.
It's fine. Question about training judges.
Gotcha.
What do they need to hear? How do they need to hear it? What role do you think that's going to play in fixing this?
To me, it gets back to the accountability question again, that we've tried in California. I know the UK just had a vote 2 days ago to try to make DV and child abuse training mandatory as part of the domestic abuse bill there, and it was rejected by the House of Commons. Even though, a member of the House of Lords, or Minka Helich, put that amendment in. We've tried in California to make mandatory judicial training for family court cases, and the judges have so much power and influence, and I will dare to say arrogance. The Judges Association routinely fights us on having any sort of mandatory judicial training. They believe that they have all the training they need. Thank you very much. And no one is going to tell us how we should be trained or who we should be trained by, the quality of the training, etc. So yeah, it's a real problem. And until we have courageous lawmakers who are willing to, get into looking at mandatory training, it's going to be a problem, but we're working on that.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. So, and this is the part I was prefacing earlier about nothing we're going to say is going to be construed as legal advice. But I got a whole bunch of questions that amount to my judge keeps issuing illegal orders or abusive orders or orders that are harming my child, orders that are harming me. What do I do? So in other words, I'm a protective mother, I'm being hurt, my kids are being hurt, I'm in the middle of this. What can I do? Again, not legal advice, but just anyone who wants to jump in here with generalities, things that do help, things that, whether it's help keep yourself healthy and sane, whether it's things that can move your case, whether it's people to reach out to.
Okay, what I would say is that the first part of it has to do with trying to speak in a way that the judge can hear, which is easier said than done. But I usually, when I want to talk about Ace and Saunders, I start with the fact that the National Council, tries to teach judges about Ace and Saunders. So for a respected judicial organization, is trying to teach that, more judges would listen. And then I will emphasize ACE comes from the CDC. Saunders comes from the National Institute of Justice in the U.S. Justice Department. So this is highly credible, peer-reviewed research. And what we're really asking the judges to do is to be open to hearing this research. That's a very reasonable request. So that's one part of it. The other thing I think we should talk about, I remember in 2010, my first book with Dr. Hannah, and we had a chapter by Garland Waller. And the chapter was about why won't the media cover the scandal? And I know, for instance, Kathleen has done a lot of good work in getting attention, to the scandal. And in 2010, we had very little, publicity about this. And in the last few years, we've done better. The Washington Post has done some good things. The ProPublico has done some work. The Boston Globe did, and there are others. And so the point is that the reason they're more willing to do it now than several years ago is because of the research. The fact that we can show journalists that there is extremely credible research that supports what the protective mothers are saying makes the media more open to this issue. It's not as good as it should be. They should be going all over the place to expose this scandal, but we're getting more done. And that's one of the few methods of accountability for judges, because one thing judges don't want is to be on the front page of the newspaper, after one of their bad decisions.
Okay, thank you for that. Thank you for that. Anything, anything else? Anyone else who's here who either like Jacqueline who's been through this, or Rachel who's just met with a lot of other women who've been through this, or Kathleen who meets with a lot of women who've gone through this. Does anything? I'm not only talking about legal stuff, but just on a human level. Does anything help?
Yeah, I can chime in on that, having talked to thousands and thousands of moms over the years, and a few dads. I think self-care is something that we really don't talk enough about, and it's so, so important. I was just on a call with a protective mom whose daughter is now 20 years old, and she's a lovely human being, but it took a decade or more of incredible parenting by this mom to get her through her trauma of sexual abuse, and having to go for years to her sexual abuser's home. And she's going to be okay. And her mom just really focused on her own self-care, and then looking at the family court battle they were in as a marathon and not a sprint. And also making sure that her daughter had routine in her life. There's actually science that shows that the brain, when it's in trauma, needs consistency and reliability in order to relax. And so making sure your kids are going to bed and getting up at the same time if possible. She used to have a snack time with her daughter, and that's when the disclosures would happen, is there was like this safe time where her brain could relax and do that. And so I think, and making sure you're taking care of yourself, because when you do have your kids, if you have visitation, they can pick up on the anxiety and the stress. And so it's really helpful to do yoga or meditation or exercise, whatever it is that can help you retain your calm and center, or get it back after going to these horrific hearings where it's really impossible to walk out of there feeling grounded and right. And so whatever practices moms can have, I think is helpful. And and being there for your child, even if it's getting on the Zoom calls that are court ordered and not sufficient, not what you want. Oh, and aggressive niceness. Don't fall into, in court, becoming the angry, vindictive woman or spouse that your abuser is painting you as. And so it's counterintuitive to being that protective mama lion that wants to, like slay everyone who's trying to harm her kids. But like, it's very difficult for the court to, it's not impossible, I know, because the courts are so upside down. But if you show up as a poised, cooperative, and I understand if you're dealing with an abuser, that's a very tall order. But, showing up in Connie Valentine, my colleague at the California Protective Parents, has always said, aggressive niceness is what confuses the abuser. And they eventually, if you give them the rope, they will hang themselves. And so that's my 2 cents on that one.
I love that phrase, aggressive niceness. I love that, but yes, that is absolutely positively key. Because you're right. As soon as you start looking like the bad guy, it makes it so much easier. Which actually leads into another question I've seen several versions of here. What do you do when you're the one who's being accused of alienation? What, again, not in legal ways, not legal advice, but tactics that protective mothers can use when they are being accused of alienation? What helps? And this is open to everyone.
You know, there's a lot of information that we can use. You know, most judges don't know that the origin of the original PAS was not based on any research. It was based on the beliefs of Gardner, which included many public statements to the effect that sex between adults and children can be acceptable. And most judges would not want to be associated with that belief. It's really important that twice the cottage industry and the abuser rights groups tried to get unscientific alienation theories into the DSM, and it was rejected by the American Psychiatric Association because there's no research to support it. And if you think about it, that should have been the end of alienation in the courts. And, you know, we need to emphasize that it's time to stop. For anyone who has a problem where they're trying to use a reunification program, there is a wonderful article in the Washington Post which investigated, and if you Google Kara Tabachnik and reunification in the Washington Post, you'll find that article which says that most of those programs are a scam. And the last thing I want to mention, in the new study by Joan Meyer, they found that when courts believe fathers' claims of alienation, then it's a big help to the father's case. If they believe mothers' claims of alienation, it has no effect on the outcome. And that's not surprising because alienation, those theories were developed specifically to help abusive fathers. They are sexist theories, and deliberately so. But what Joan's research shows is that the way the courts are implementing, using unscientific alienation theories, it's being done in a way that violates due process and equal protection. And so I think we should make an application to bar any evidence or any claims of alienation until and unless it can be used in a way that is equal for men and women. As long as they're using it to only help fathers, you know, it's illegal.
Okay, yes, thank you for that. And here is another one that I actually want to throw at Barry, but anyone else can jump in afterwards if they have experience with this. How do you feel about presumed 50-50 co-parenting laws? Does that make life easier or harder for protective mothers?
You know, Elizabeth Liu and I, in our book representing the domestic violence survivor, we have a chapter about shared parenting that goes into the history, goes into the research. And the bottom line is there is some legitimate research that would support shared parenting under the most favorable circumstances. I think there is better research that shared parenting is never a good idea. But what is absolutely certain, and there is no research to challenge it, is that if it's not the best circumstances, if the parents can't get along, if there is unequal power between the parents, if one parent is afraid of the other, those cases should never consider shared parenting. And there's good information in the Saunders study, which also shows that shared parenting should not be considered in domestic violence cases. And, you know, lots of times the courts or the other side want to say well, you haven't proved domestic violence. If the parties are making charges against each other and saying how bad the other one is, that's not a case for shared parenting. And one of the things I like to do, because I think in court, we want to reframe the kinds of things that the abusers and their attorneys say. And so every time the abuser attacks the mother, part of the response is, and so therefore the abuser is confirming what we're saying, that this is not a case for shared parenting. If the abuser thinks that about the mother, then you shouldn't have shared parenting in a case like this.
Melanie, I'd like to jump in just for 1 second and tag on to what Barry just mentioned about, when I'm often talking to people about Curious Champions and advocating for legislation, people don't understand this from a holistic standpoint. First of all, shared parenting happens in most cases because the vast majority of cases actually involve what I'll call healthy breakups. Even if the people are sad or mad at each other initially from the breakup, they settle outside of court. And these are, non-abusive scenarios. They end up in some form of shared parenting there. It's the ones that end up in family court that have domestic violence and child abuse attached to these. And so when we look at shared parenting, we got to identify the difference between the two, the ones that settle outside court and the ones that remain in family court. Now, the ones that remain in family court have significantly high cases with volumes of domestic violence and child abuse. In New York State, when I went through Kira's case, until custody is determined, you are considered to have shared parenting. And this is a disastrous concept, like Barry mentioned, when you have a parent who's abusive. And this is what leads to children being abused at epidemic rates and children being murdered at the staggering rates in which they are. And I know this firsthand. So when we look at this, we have to look at what cases we're actually applying this to and where it's detrimental.
Okay, thank you for that. And that actually segues beautifully into the next question, which I was going to ask you about. So what are the provisions of Kira's law, which is in large part what we are trying to get passed in every state? But talk about that a little bit. Talk about the provisions of that and why they're going to work.
Yeah. To fully understand Kira's law, you have to understand what happened in Kira's case, because Kira's law is based on what happened and what went wrong in her case. I walked into Nassau County Family Court when Kira was only 6 weeks old. Like many of you who are out there, I heard the messages to get out of an abusive relationship, and I left to protect Kira when I was pregnant. And when I walked into court that first time, like I said earlier, I thought, my God, of course, the courts are going to protect them, Kira, and keep her safe. And that couldn't be farther from the truth. The first time that I walked into the courtroom, and I came forward with the fact that Kira's father was harassing me, threatening me, and I had considerable concerns about Kira, and came forward with evidence about being stalked. The judge in Kira's case looked at me, Judge Danielle Peterson, and yelled at me to grow up. That was her response. Well, because of Judge Peterson, Kira will never grow up. We had Child Protective Services involved in Kira's case. And they noted that he had extreme anger and rage issues and inability to care for her. And yet they labeled the case low risk and no domestic violence. We had an attorney for the child who I begged repeatedly to get more involved. Things were wrong. Kira was coming back from visits and things were incredibly off. And even 5 days before Kira was murdered. And he refused. We had a forensic evaluator involved in Kira's case. And this is a mental health professional that many of you are leveraging in your custody cases, who had eyewitness accounts, documented evidence, knew that he was suicidal, and had purchased guns. And in his report, he recommended joint custody because Dr. Larry Cohen believes that a father should always play a role in a child's life, quote unquote. Well, her father did play a huge role in Kira's life. He murdered her. And at our last hearing in Nassau County Family Court, Judge Peterson said to me, quote unquote, this is not a life or death situation. She was wrong. Everyone involved in Kira's case had the opportunity to protect her and keep her safe. Just 2 months after that hearing, Kira was murdered. And her murder was entirely 100% preventable. And as I sat down with legislators and started to look at what can we do to protect children, we looked at and identified a number of different areas, and that really has become Kira's Law. The first of which is to make the health and safety the top priority of best interest factors in child custody cases, something that's common sense, but not happening in reality. We should be employing ACE. I never once heard ACE or the study throughout Kira's custody case, and we were there for 2.5 years. The second thing that it's going to do is mandate judge training. And here we have identified 2 incredible groups to do the judge training so that anyone who oversees a family law case on child custody that involves domestic violence or child abuse absolutely goes through this. What we're also putting in here is something that's key and critical, and this is an early evidentiary hearing that allows the litigants to come forward if there's been any domestic violence against the partner or the child. And in Kira's case, I kept being told, well, you can bring that forward at trial. You can be bringing that forward at trial. Her trial date was set for October of 2016. She was murdered a few months earlier in July of 2016. I never had the opportunity to bring that forward. So by putting in an early evidentiary hearing that's similar to a restraining order, you can bring things forward to protect your child so much earlier. It's going to get rid of some of the things like Barry mentioned talking about. We're not going to allow for reunification therapy in camps. These are hurting children. Why are we forcing children to bond with their abusers? That doesn't make sense. So, and what we're also going to make sure is if there is abuse, that the safe parent, the non-offending parent, gets sole custody, and that we're using the top research, like Barry mentioned, in custody cases. So this is a common sense legislation that is going to move us light years forward in protecting children.
Thank you for that. I mean, thank you. I mean, I don't just mean for answering that question, but for doing what you are doing. Rising from the hardest thing a parent can ever go through. Trying to keep other parents from having to go through it again.
It happened to Kira, can happen to someone you know or love, whether it's a family member or a friend or a work colleague, unless changes are made. And hope is, hope's here. There are things that we can do today to make that become a reality.
Jacqueline, you're fantastic.
Thank you, Rachel. And the same thing about all of you.
And so we're getting lots and lots and lots of questions in the chat about what can we do to help get Kira's Law passed? What can we do to bring this up to other states? We're going to get to that. We have a call to action we're going to get to in just a minute. Barry, do you have anything else you want to add about the Safe Child Act? Because we've been kind of pushing things like Kira's Law in other states. I do want to add, because I'm seeing people asking, how can I get this in my state? This is something the Stop Abuse campaign is working on. It takes a lot of organization, it takes a lot of effort and time. We're getting there. One thing I advise anyone else to do is you can go to our Facebook page, go to the Stop Abuse campaign action page. Ask to join, answer the questions. I do not let anyone in there unless you answer the questions, because you need to make sure you're a real human being. But this is a tool we are going to be using to organize. But Barry, do you have anything you want to add about Safe Child Act?
The first thing, I just want to express my appreciation to the courage that moms like Jacqueline and Kathy, who is Caden's mom, you know, they have a moral authority that none of the rest of us can possibly have. And they have every right to take care of themselves. And instead, they sacrifice themselves, to try to make sure that other children don't suffer the same fate. And you really have to admire what they were doing. I just want to say that. Um, and it is exciting that the Stop Abuse campaign is doing a lot of work to try to get these laws passed. And I very much believe that if we can get one or two states to pass a version of the Safe Child Act, that it's going to be much easier in other states. And Melanie, you'll remember when we first started talking to legislators in New York, and we were talking about the Safe Child Act, and their first thing is, do you have the text? Because getting the legislation written is a big hurdle to overcome. So we now have versions in 6 states, and that makes it easier. In each state, it's going to be different, both in terms of what the legislator who's sponsoring it is willing to include, and also what laws there are in each state. But fundamentally, we need people to speak with their legislators, because this has to be a state law, and seek sponsors for the Safe Child Act. And, what we want to do is work with our colleagues, with our partners. If we're in California, if we would do it, we would be working we'd be working with the California Protective Parents Association. And there are many people who are part of our Stop Abuse campaign in California, and we can work with them. We can work with the state coalition against domestic violence. And, once we get a law introduced, then we'll bring everyone together to try to get it passed. And, we will have whatever support we can provide in terms of telling people what's in the law, why we need it, how you can contact your legislators, things like that. And we will work together with you.
Okay, thank you so much, Barry. Thank you so much to everyone, to all of these wonderful panelists who agreed to help us on the Saturday when there's fun to be had and other things in this world, but thank you to everyone for joining us. I want to turn it over to our hostess, Kim, who is going to talk about the call to action, and she has some links and stuff about what we can, how we can all work together to fix this mess.
Thank you, Melanie. Let me just share that real quick. All right. So yes, a big thank you to all of our experts, Barry, Jacqueline, Rachel, Kathleen, Melanie. The information you've shared today is so important and informative to all of us. So thank you for your vulnerability and your time today.